Good afternoon. This is Chavez and Valko, your full service immigration law firm, the key to your immigration solutions. I am Senior Associate Ben Hamilton. Here today with me is Associate Andrew Craven. And when you see our smiling faces, that we're going to be talking about all things employment based. So today, Andrew, what are we talking about?
Today we are talking about E2 treaty investors.
I have to say, this is maybe my favorite visa category. Andrew, what are your thoughts?
It's definitely a popular one. It's a fun one. Get to see all kinds of different businesses that people are trying to start up here in the States, and just always a fun one to get to see new and creative ideas out there.
Totally agree. It's not always the easiest category, but it is one of the most interesting as we do get to see sort of the ins and outs of dozens and dozens and hundreds of different businesses from large to small to startups to, you know, you want to know how much it costs to buy a McDonald's franchise, happen to know that, or build an apartment complex, happen to know that, or import a certain product, we happen to know that. So the E2 is one of the funnest because it really makes you think, keeps you on your toes. You get to learn a lot just about business and how people start. I love it. So, Andrew, give us the definition here. What is an E2
So
visa?
basically, the E2 is a non-immigrant classification, and this allows nationals from treaty countries to come to the U.S. when they're investing a substantial amount of capital in a U.S. business. It also applies to certain employees of the same sort of people, qualifying organization of one of these E2 investors to come here and work for that kind of a company.
So, there's a bunch of requirements here, Andrew. I'm going to ask you to let us know what they are, and then we'll go through them one by one. So, what are the requirements for an E2 visa?
All right, so we got 9 requirements here. Very basic. Requisite treaty has to exist. So it's treaty investors have to have the treaty. The person, business has to actually have the nationality of that treaty company. The applicant also has to have invested or actively be in the process of investing. Treaty investor visas. So we have the treaty, we have the investment. After that, number 4, the enterprise has to be real and operating commercial enterprise. Uh, Followed by the investment actually has to be substantial. It can't be a smaller amount. The investment is more than marginal, basically more than just earning a living. Number 7, the applicant has to be in a position to develop and direct that enterprise. Then after that, number 8, if they're an employee, they have to be destined for an executive or supervisory position or possess skills essential to that firm's operation in the US. And finally, they actually have to intend to depart the US at the end of that E2 status.
So that's a mouthful. And if you're wondering how this stacks up compared to the E1, yes, it does have more requirements, so it is a little more complicated. We do have cases in which people actually qualify for both the E1 treaty trader and the E2 treaty investor. And in those cases, we usually say do the E1 because it's actually a little easier. So we're going to start with requirement number 1, requisite treaty. So can anybody apply for an E2 visa?
No. So just like the E1, uh, there actually has to be that existing treaty between our country and the country of that person's nationality. And they actually have to have that nationality to apply for it.
Okay, so we have things like the H and the L and the O that apply to anybody, any nationality, doesn't matter where you're from. And then we have certain ones that are specific to certain nationalities, like the E3 for Australians, H1B1 to Singapore, Chile, TN to Canada, Mexico. E kind of falls into the middle there, where it's like it's not for everybody, but it's not limited to one country. So, about how many countries do we have EV treaties with right now?
So right now it's about 75.
Well, that's actually more than the E1. That's always interesting to see how we have some countries that we do have E2 treaties, but E1's not included, trade's not included. So, what are some notable omissions, countries with whom you would think maybe we would, but we don't?
So the big three are China, India, and Brazil. So again, some of those BRIC countries that the treaty just doesn't exist with them.
I mean, if we did have one, wow, it would completely change the immigration landscape. We think of all the Indian nationals right now coming on H-1Bs. It's backlogged. They're waiting years and years and years to be able to apply for residency, to be all and they're stuck, kind of tied to a company that's sponsoring them. To all of a sudden they have this option where they could just go on their own, start their own business. That would be awesome. But unfortunately, it's not currently on the table for them. So China, India, Brazil also, most of the countries with whom we do not get along, like Venezuela, Cuba, Iran, also not on the list. But you can just Google it, find it, look through, see if your country's there. Are there any recent additions to the list of treaty countries?
So most recently, New Zealand and Israel. So if you've just been wanting to open a U.S. business and you're Israeli or from New Zealand, then now's the time you can actually use this visa to start up one of those businesses.
Yeah, the Israel one's kind of weird because we've actually had a treaty with them for a while. We were just waiting for the Department of State to sort of make it official and say that they were, going to start accepting the E2 applications. But it was actually there for quite a while. Sometimes it takes them forever to update stuff. Any recent eliminations, countries with whom we had a treaty and no longer do?
Yeah, so recently Ecuador and Bolivia have been removed from the list.
That kind of goes back to the new governments with whom we don't get along so well. They remove them from the list. Now, there are certain people, if they already had the e-visa, can continue to renew it for a period of time, but no new applications. So now here's the important question. We're going to give a specific example of one we see a lot. What if I'm from Venezuela, a country with whom we do not have a treaty? But I'm able to acquire a second nationality through my parents or grandparents. So I can get an Italian passport or maybe a Spanish passport. Can I qualify?
Yes. So similar to the E1, the E2 is based on nationality. So it's about the nationality that you hold, not where you were born. So you could actually, if you have the ability to acquire nationality of another country, say through marriage or some other method, then you can use that nationality to get your E2.
Another place we've seen this a lot is for Indian nationals who immigrated to Canada and then they got Canadian citizenship and then they were able to apply for like a TN or an E2 because it's not about where you're born, it's about what nationality you hold, and you can hold more than one nationality. Um, so that actually brings us into the next topic where it says that the individual and the business have to possess the nationality of the treaty country. But we're talking about a U.S. business. So how does a U.S. business, let's say one incorporated here in Texas, possess the nationality of a treaty country?
So here we're really talking about the company has the nationality of its owner. Uh, and so it's not about where the company is actually incorporated so much as, well, who's the actual owner of that business and what is their nationality. So say Mexican national comes and starts a business, incorporates it in Texas. Well, if that Mexican national owns 100% of that business, then it is a Mexican business.
Yeah, for purposes of the E2. Now, let's just say hypothetically, let's say that Mexican national comes, he wants to set up a business in the US, but naturally he's going to look for maybe a business partner here to help. And so they decide to go into business and it's 50-50. So Mexican national owns 50% and let's say a US citizen owns 50%. Does that work?
That works as long as it's that 50%. So 50% is the threshold, and as long as 50% of the business is owned by a national of the treaty country, then it will qualify for the purposes of E2.
Throw out another question here. What if I have four owners, right? Two Mexican, two US citizens. So now it's 25, 25, 25, 25, but collectively those two Mexicans own 50%. Does that still qualify?
Yes, because it still has 50% ownership of folks from that treaty country. So
This
you
gets
can
really
split it up as much as you want, as long as you hit that 50% threshold from the treaty country, you're good.
Yeah, this gets really fun when you start seeing people that are getting sort of, venture capital or outside funding where they may have 30, 40, 50 different shareholders, and you're going through and figuring out, okay, who's Mexican, who's a US citizen, who's something else, and adding it up to see if it gets you over that 50% in order to qualify. So, see this a lot too. What if I'm a Mexican national? I have a business in Mexico, and I set up a US company, and the direct owner of that US company is my Mexican business. So the parent company, or so the owner is another company.
So in that case, we have to trace it to the actual person that owns it. So you can have your Mexican national who owns, you know, any number of holding companies that route through any number of countries, but we trace it all the way back to the actual person that owns the company ultimately.
And we've had to do this through 4, 5, 6 levels sometimes, where it's like, well, who owns a US holding company? Well, who owns that? A Mexican holding company. Well, who owns that? And you just keep tracing it back until you figure out, well, who are the actual people, individuals that own the company? Um, but what if the parent company is publicly traded? Do I need to then dig up the passports of the 30,000 shareholders or 20,000 shareholders to see if collectively 50% own it?
Um, that would be incredibly painful. So luckily, no. At that point, we look at the stock exchange where the company's stock is traded. So, are you in the New York Stock Exchange? Are you in, the Mexican Stock Exchange? Or where is that the stock publicly traded?
Great. So we check to see if there's a treaty. Then we look at who the owners are, and do nationals of the treaty country collectively own 50%. So the next one is has invested or is actively in the process of investing. So when we're talking about this, we're not talking about the amount. We're going to get to that later where it talks about substantial investment. This is more about kind of like the process. So one of the key things that we have to look at is or would assume, is the source of funds. Do we have to document where the money came from?
Yes, and this is always a tricky one just because, there's so much moving around when folks are trying to start a business, but you have to document everything because ultimately we have to prove that the funds didn't come from any illicit activities. So it can't be money that's, stolen or from drug dealing or anything like that. We got to prove up where it came from and that it was something legitimate.
So, what are some legitimate sources of funds?
So savings, you just work, saved up the money, gifts, inheritance, loans, sale proceeds, just about any legitimate source, any way that folks are normally making money.
So, yeah, we tend to see a lot of people. We tend to see, three things. One is, I own a business. The business makes money, and I'm using money from that business abroad to invest. It comes from like a business source. We do tend to see a lot of gifts. It tends to be someone gets money like from their parents or something to invest and start a business. Tends to be very common. Then I would say maybe the third one tends to be proceeds from a sale. Like I own land in Mexico, I sell it, and then I use that land to invest in a business. So those tend to be kind of the most common we see. Now we mentioned loans. If I get like a loan to start the business, can that count as a legitimate source of funds?
Getting a loan, yeah, it is included because ultimately, I mean, there's some complicated issues there, but you're taking a loan that you're going to have to pay back, so that's still a form of investment.
Yeah, so that one's a little bit tricky because, I mean, can I get a loan? Yeah, you can get a loan. I mean, you can use the loan to start your business, but the question is whether or not they're going to count it as as part of the investment when they're evaluating it. And the number one thing they look at is who's responsible for the loan. So if the loan is exclusively collateralized on the assets of the US company, then that's not going to, I mean, you can use it to fund the company, but they're not going to count it as part of your investment because they don't see that as being at risk. Whereas if you have a loan that's collateralized on personal property, that totally counts. So if I like put my house up as collateral to get this loan that I'm going to use to fund my business, then that's totally going to be counted towards the investment because you're personally on the hook. Interesting question. We see a lot. Do the funds actually have to originate from outside the United States?
No, they don't. It's, all about that person's nationality, even if, they're earning funds in the US.
Yeah, so we see people that have maybe in the past bought a property in the United States as like an investment, and then they decide to sell that and then invest that. So, I mean, maybe if we go back through the chain, maybe the money did come from abroad, but at least on the immediate chain that we're going to document, it's just a sell of a property in the US. And that's actually fine, just as long as we can show that the foreign national owned that property. It doesn't matter that it originates from the US. So, we see this a lot too, where people kind of oversimplify it and they say, well, okay, I got the money. I can prove that it's legitimate. I moved it into a US bank account, so I get the visa, right? That's all I have to
No,
do.
no. So a big part of it is that the funds actually have to be at risk. So the money actually has to be spent on qualifying expenses before you can actually apply for the visa. You can't just say, here's my wad of cash, therefore I get the visa now, right?
So this is the whole chicken before the egg. So a lot of people are like, well, how am I going to start the business if I don't have the visa? Well, it's like, actually, no, you can't get the visa until the business is pretty much started. They say, well, how do I do that? Well, actually, your tourist visa is a B1, B2. There's two components to it. And which one they stamp in your passport depends on what you say when you come in. So if you come in and you show them a tourist visa and they say, what do you do? And you say, I'm going to Disneyland, they're going to put B2. It means you're here as a tourist for pleasure. But if you show up and you say, what's your purpose? You say, well, I got to attend some sales meetings, going to a conference. I'm a manager of this foreign company. Then they're going to stamp B1. So it's actually perfectly legitimate to enter as a tourist to set up a company. Now, you can't manage it, you can't operate it. That's what you need the visa for. But you can set it up, do everything you need to do and then go apply for the visa. So are there are there any exceptions to the sort of the money has to be like at risk, like 100% spent in order to apply?
Yes. So one of the big exceptions that if you're purchasing a business, so you're going in to buy this business, the investment funds can be placed in escrow with release to the seller conditioned on the issuance of the E2 visa. Basically, once I actually get the visa, then there will be the final transfer.
Yeah, so they consider these at risk because the funds are going to be released to the seller, to this third party, and really the only condition is the issuance of the visa. So the second the visa is issued, the money goes to the seller. They own the business. So you can use escrow as a way to kind of protect yourself in the context where you're purchasing a business. So we say the money has to be at risk, which usually means spent on qualifying expenses. Now, if you're buying a business, that's pretty straightforward. I bought the business. But if I'm starting my own business, right, it's going to be a whole bunch of like smaller transactions. So what are qualifying expenses?
So basically any legitimate expense towards starting the business. And this is going to include a lot. So lease payments, purchasing inventory, getting equipment, marketing. So paying for all of the advertisement, getting the name out there. And a big one of our favorites is professional services. So you hire your attorney to help you with this process, that counts as a part of your expenses, or hiring your accountant to get this all figured out. That's going to count too.
Yeah, it could be like a corporate attorney to help set up the company. It can be third party professionals that are helping with like your marketing and graphic design, doing like your website, just about anything that's a legitimate expense. Even sometimes travel, because you have people that are coming from their country to here specifically for the purposes of scouting out a location to try to figure out, okay, where am I going to set up? I got to meet with some people, so we can include um, some travel. Like I said, like usually like lease deposits and payments are big chunks. Of course, depending on what you do, it can be equipment or inventory. Um, Here's another important one. Does it have to be necessarily cash? Like I transfer cash to the bank account in the US and then I just go spend cash on these things?
So interestingly enough, no, it doesn't just have to be cash, but it can, include transfer of ownership of property and equipment, things of that nature.
So I've seen a couple different examples. One is somebody who individually bought a piece of land in their name, and then they decided that's where they wanted to build their US office. So they then transferred ownership of the land from their name to the company, right? And as long as we can assign, a value to that land, we can say that's part of your investment. I've seen the same thing with inventory, for example. Hey, we manufacture this item in Mexico, and I'm going to send $100,000 worth of inventory to the U.S. company. Like they're not going to buy it from me. I'm just going to send it to them. And of course, one way to sort of prove the value would be through the customs documentation to say, I'm investing. I'll see with equipment too. Hey, I have a whole bunch of machines that I use in our factory in Mexico, and I'm actually going to send those machines to the US to put in the new factory that we're building in the US. So a lot of times, people are able to, now, as long as we can put a value to it, you can include the value of some of these things that you're transferring. Even IP. We've had cases where someone's, they developed this IP in the foreign country, and then they transferred the ownership of the IP to the U.S. company. Now, as long as we can value that, put a number to it, we can include that. So sometimes you'll see people where their total investment's $200,000, but only half of that was actual cash, and the other half was some type of asset they were transferring. Okay, so we're going to move off the sort of process of investing and move to the next one, which is the enterprise is a real and operating commercial enterprise. So, what does it mean to be real and active?
So to be real and active, it basically precludes speculative investing or passive investing. So this can't just be like, you know, I bought stock or, I'm just running out this one place without it really being an active business.
I love that one. I've heard it proposed to me all the time, and I always tell clients no. Like, they come and say, "Well, if I just buy a house and rent it," saying, "Well, no. I mean, yes, you may have invested a substantial amount of money, but that's not a full time job. Renting one house, going and collecting a rent check once a month." But you'd be surprised how often people ask about that, and usually we steer them away from that into something that's actually going to work. But I have one of my closest friends is a consular officer, and so he's worked for years now on the opposite end, adjudicating these cases. And he's like, man, you'd be surprised how many people showed up with that exact application saying, oh yeah, I bought a house, give me the visa. And it's like, well, no, that's not an actual like business. What about nonprofits? Can a nonprofit qualify for the E2?
No, it's got to be a for-profit business.
Yeah, so I mean, for whatever reason, they've just decided that the real and active requirement specifically precludes nonprofits, which kind of sucks because there's some great, companies out there we've worked with that are nonprofits, but it doesn't qualify. So does this mean the company has to be open for business when they
So,
apply?
not quite, but it either has to be open for business or ready to open upon issuance of the visa. So it can't be ways out. You got to be ready to open almost just right away.
Yeah,
So,
so you say, well,
sorry.
how do I open a business if I don't have the visa? I mean, obviously, in a business where you're able to hire people, right? You can hire people to kind of start running the business until you get the visa, so it's actually open. Or you can show that, hey, I went and negotiated all these contracts, I have all this work, like it's ready to go. So like the second I walk in with the visa in hand, bam, we're off to the races. What you can't do is say, hey, I'm going to open this restaurant. I spent a lot of money. Let's say, well, when are you going to open it? Well, it's actually we're renovating. It's going to open in 5 months. Then you run the risk of them saying, well, come back in 5 months. And I've actually had that happen in Mexico. So again, it has to be pretty much near to open, and it has to be something that would actually require your sort of full time work. So renting one house, no. But if I don't know, buy a whole bunch of duplexes, I've had clients that have done this, and we have 40, 50 units. Okay, renting out 40 or 50 units is more like a full-time job, and maintaining them and dealing with everything around that. Or if I'm like flipping homes, if you buy one home and you're like renovating it, and you say, well, I want to go apply, that's a little tricky because they may look at that and say, well, how do I know that's just not your personal residence that you're renovating? I had a client try that too once. So usually in that case, we've gotten them for home flippers, but usually we say, do your first full flip before you apply to where you've bought it, renovated it, sold it. You're saying, well, am I going to violate my status? Well, no, you're hiring a general contractor usually who's actually kind of overseeing the day-to-day until you get the visa. So now we're going to move to obviously, which is probably the most important question, the biggest question that everyone has, which is, it says the applicant's investment is substantial. So what qualifies? Is there a set amount that qualifies as a substantial investment?
No, this is another area where we just kind of get substantial and there's no hard line, just this number is the threshold. So it's really a proportionality test based on the reasonable needs of the business.
Yeah, so a lot of people get a little bit confused here because they're like, "Well, I heard it was like 500,000, and then they upped it to 900,000." You're like, "No, that's EB5, which is a residency category, and yes, it does have set numbers. It's 1.8 million, which a lot of people are like, whoa, I don't got that type of money. And if you're able to invest in a targeted employment area, then it's lowered to 900,000 now. But that is EB5. That has nothing to do with the E2. So you said proportionality. What is that? What's proportionality?
So the proportionality test determines whether an investment is substantial by weighing the amount of the qualifying funds invested against the cost of the business. And then if these two figures are exactly the same, then the investor has invested, 100% of the needed funds in the business.
So, how does it work if I'm purchasing an existing business then? How do they determine proportionality?
So then it's just defined as the fair market value of the business. So, or, you sit here and look at the business, the fair market value is say 100,000 and you pay 100,000, then there's the proportional investment of 100% of the needed funds.
Yeah, it really comes down to the proving fair market value. You usually want to go like to an accountant or someone that can do like a professional evaluation to say this is what the business is worth. Where you run into issues is where it's like, well, I'm buying the business from my brother and he's selling it to me for 50,000, and it's like, well, they're going to take a look at the numbers and they may kind of challenge you on like, maybe this was like a $200,000 business, you only paid 50, and that's not proportional, right? That's like what, 25% of what the cost was. But yeah, I mean, the closer you are to 100%, the more likely you are to not have any issues. But what I've also found is that the sort of the lower the investment, the closer they want you to be to 100%. So if you're saying I'm investing my total investment is going to be 100,000, then you better invest 100,000. Whereas like you're saying, well, the total I need is 500, but today I've only done 450. And then usually in those cases, because it's a higher number, they're like, oh, okay, 90% is fine. Whereas the 100% is necessary for lower investments. So how does it work from starting my own company? Obviously, it doesn't have a fair market value because it doesn't exist yet. So how do they determine proportionality for a new company?
Right. So if you're just starting out, from scratch, then substantials really defines the cost needed to establish the business to the point of being operational. So what does it take to get the doors open, basically?
And the crazy thing is, well, I'm going to ask the question, who determines what's required to start the business?
At that point, it's really up to the applicant to just show like this is what it takes to get the doors
Yeah.
open. This is what I'm doing and how much it's going to cost.
So usually so usually they include it in their business plan, right? So a new company is always going to need a business plan. We're going to talk about that later. But as part of the business plan, they put in like their project. This is what we think it's going to cost to get the business up and running. So this is what we think we're going to be paying in like lease deposits, renovations, equipment, inventory, whatever it is. They put in those numbers, and then they come out with like a number. So let's say it's $200,000. So if they then go out and can prove that they spent $200,000 and the company is open, then the proportionality is 100%. They met proportionality. Um, so it's really about what are the reasonable needs. Now, if you say, "Hey, I'm going to open a restaurant and I only need $50,000," they may be a little skeptical. Um, so usually it has to kind of line up. Now, there are restaurants you can open for 100. 50. I mean, I don't know. I've done some like taco trucks for 50, but a full scale restaurant, but those can go up. So one of the things you're going to note is that the rules do account for service businesses, because you say, well, what if I'm like an engineer? I mean, I don't need like a bunch of inventory or really that much equipment past like computer and some stuff. They actually account for that in the rules, and they say that they account for the fact that, and they actually say that a service business they require less. So we do see a lot of cases that are under $100,000 and get approved. The majority of them do tend to be service oriented. Now, again, it's what it takes you to get from zero to open. So the smaller the required investment is, then the better your evidence needs to be that you are in fact open, right? Because they're always going to be skeptical about what $50,000 to open this business. Really? Well, then you better show you spent 50,000 and you are open. Otherwise, they're going to take any little bit, like, oh, you only spent 40, or maybe you're not quite open yet, and use that against you. Here's the other thing too. When a lot of people, here's the question: a lot of people, when they're setting up a new business, right, they're not getting not just enough money to go from zero to doors open, right? They're usually going to need money set aside to cover operating costs. So they're going to say, well, we really need 100,000 to open up, but probably 150 to see us through the first 6 months. Is that necessary for an E2?
I'm sorry, that was a long question.
Is when I'm looking at the amount required to start my business, does it include, do I have to include operating costs for a specific period, or is it just zero to doors open?
That's really about, zero to doors open, but you can include, and then later you're going to need to show real and operating your follow-up operating expenses.
Yeah, so you don't actually have to show that you're going to have that ongoing money. You don't have to say, well, I think we're going to need, $50,000 to get through the first 6 months. So my original investment's 100 plus that 50, 150. No. The amount required to get the visa is just zero to doors open. Now, you can put that extra 50 in and have it in a bank account and show it and tell them that it's to cover operating costs. That's great. But again, if 100 is zero to doors open, all you need to invest is 100. Now, I'm going to say most of our cases, I would say, range from about 150 to 300. That's probably the average price range for most of the E's that we see. But again, we've done as low as 50, done a lot under 100, and we've seen some that are, hundreds of millions. All right, so next question, this marginality. This is the fun one, just because everyone sees that word and is like, what is, so what's kind of like the definition of marginality?
I mean, the real short version is, if it's a marginal, we're talking about, it can't just be something to support you. Like, this has to be a real business that's generating enough income to really be expanding. So a marginal enterprise would be an enterprise that does not have the present or future capacity to generate enough income to provide more than a minimal living for the treaty investor or their family.
And so the weird thing here is you have to prove that your company is not marginal, right? Because a marginal enterprise doesn't generate much money. So it's this kind of weird inverse where it's a not. Well, obviously, with an existing company, like if I'm buying an existing company, that should be fairly straightforward because they're going to have a history of tax returns and employees, W-2s, 941s, bank statements. There's going to be all this history to fall back on to be able to demonstrate, no, this is not a marginal enterprise, which would, the same analysis would apply to a renewal. But what if I'm applying for the first time in a business that I just created? How am I going to prove that the company's not marginal?
I mean, at the point where it's a new business, you have just no past sales or anything like that. Then we're talking about projected future capacity to make, significant economic contributions within the next 5 years from the date of, the commencement of business. So basically, 5 years after doors open, how much money are we going to make?
So this is where we're coming back to the business plan. This is where the business plan is absolutely key. If it's a new company, you have to have a business plan, and that business plan is going to lay out your employment and financial projections for 5 years. And this is kind of the one area where immigration law actually makes sense, because if you're doing a new office L1A visa, you have to prove that your company is going to be like rocking it within 1 year, and it's like that's completely unrealistic. I mean, who's going to be off the ground and running like that in 1 year, whereas the E allows 5 years. Which makes way more sense in terms of how long it takes. So yes, to get that first E, got to have a detailed business plan. So the next requirement is called Develop and Direct, which is like this weird one that doesn't exist in the E1, but only exists in the E2. So what does that mean? What does it mean to develop and direct?
Basically, that you intend to actively manage the U.S. investment. So you have to have a more hands-on role in this new business.
Yeah, so I definitely don't want to see someone who's a passive investor, like, hey, I put all this money in, and then I'm just going to go like sip pina coladas on the beach while the business runs. It's like, no, not going to work. Well, how do I prove it? How do I prove this?
So generally, when you own at least 50%, so you own at least half of that U.S. company, this satisfies the develop and direct requirement.
So if we go back to our previous example of, hey, I got four owners, two Americans, two Mexicans. So it satisfies the nationality requirement because the two Mexicans collectively own 50%, but one of them is applying, but he individually only owns 25%. So how does he, as a minority shareholder, satisfy the develop and direct requirement?
So then you have to demonstrate control through a corporate instrument or some sort of managerial control. So basically, your assignment in this company, when you sit down with your three other investors, is you're going to have some sort of managerial role, or somewhere on a corporate instrument. It kind of demonstrates that you're going to have a hands-on role in this company.
Yeah, so you can say, yeah, there's four owners, but if you look at the minutes of meeting, I'm named as the president of the company, and the bylaws define that as the dude having all the power. The other easier way is actually this is what we're going to jump into next: is you just make the argument that they qualify as also as a supervisor. And we've done this, for example. I remember years ago I was working with a restaurant investment group, and they have 5 or 6 restaurants, and there was like 10 people, 10 different investors, and I think 4 or 5 of them had visas within the company. And we had to be like, okay, he's the CEO. This guy's doing all the marketing. He's the marketing manager, and we had to this guy's the operations manager. And we had to kind of like divvy up and present them each as a supervisor because they're all minority shareholders. So that's going to take us into actually the next one is about employees. So we know owners can qualify. That's pretty straightforward. But can I potentially, let's say I'm a Mexican national, I open this business, I get the e-visa for myself, or maybe I don't, but but I have this guy over here. He's my right hand man. Can I bring him in on a e-visa?
Yes, as long as he's a supervisor or an essential employee, and he has the same nationality as the company and its owners.
So this is where the nationality thing can kind of be a problem because, again, if you're saying, "Oh, I'm a Venezuelan national, we don't qualify, but I have an Italian passport, I'm going to apply under my Italian passport." Great, you can qualify, but then you're like, "Oh, wait, but I want to bring my right hand man, and he's just Venezuelan." It's like, sorry, you can't. He has to have the same nationality. So, what factors do they look at when they're considering whether or not somebody qualifies as a supervisor?
So, first thing they're going to consider is the title. Is this guy CEO or is he the janitor? Then they're going to look at the position in the organizational structure. So you get this long flow chart. Is he closer to the top of the flow chart or the bottom? Then the duties of the position, is this the CEO, but he's responsible for mopping the floors, or, does it really list out that he's going to have some sort of managerial or executive duties? Then they're going to look at kind of control and responsibility. So are you only allowed to do what you're told, or, do you have some real control? Number and skill level of the subordinates, level of pay, how much you're making, and then finally whether or not the that person possesses the qualifying executive or supervisory experience. So what have you done in the past?
And the good thing here is it's no one factor is controlling. It's more of a collective. Hey, we're going to look at all this stuff. Um, so one of the issues that we comes up with is talk about this a little bit later is family kids. Sometimes age out. Right? They're too old to be considered part of the family, and sometimes people are like, "Well, can I get my kid in as a supervisor?" It's like, well, it's going to be hard if they're young, they have no educational experience, or maybe, hey, no, my kid's been working in my company since he was 18. He knows it front and back. Like, oh, okay, well, maybe we can sell it. How about essential? How do they define an essential employee? What are the characteristics they look at?
So when we're talking about essential employees, they're going to look at experience and training necessary to achieve the essential skills, the uniqueness of those skills, uh, the availability of U.S. workers that have the same set of skills, the salary, such as that expertise can actually command, the degree of proven expertise that that person has in that area of specialization, and finally, the functions of the job that that person is destined to have.
So again, it's a collective test. We're looking at a bunch of factors and kind of balancing them all together. But there's one reason that I do not like essential employees, especially under the Trump administration, is because it's one of the only visa categories, non-immigrant visa categories, that says the availability of U.S. workers. Oh man. Um, no other non-immigrant visa has that. Now, there's some you're applying for residency that could become a factor, but for non-immigrant visas, really nowhere else has that factor. Um, and that's one that they can really use against you to basically say, well, did you even attempt to get a U.S. worker? And if the answer is no, hypothetically, they could deny you even if everything else checks out. So that's why if we're presented with the option of either or, hey, this person could qualify as both an essential employee and a supervisor, we tend to always go supervisor. Because we just don't want to have that on the table. All right, so it says they have to intend to depart. That sounds a little weird, but what does that mean? What does it mean to intend to depart?
Uh, Basically, at the end of your status, you're going to leave the country and go home.
Do I have to maintain a foreign residence while I'm in the U.S. As an e-visa holder?
No, not while you're an visa holder.
It's interesting because it actually specifically states that in the rules. You do not have to maintain a foreign residence like you would with a tourist visa or student visa. And sometimes you run into officers that just don't know the e-visa regulations and they'll think you have to, and you have to fight with them over it. But okay, so how do I prove this? If I'm going to my visa interview, how do I prove to the officer that I intend to return to my home country?
So the fancy way of saying it is an expression of an unequivocal intent to depart the United States upon termination of your status. Uh, you know, Really, we're talking about a signed statement, a short paragraph that says, "I, my name, intend to depart the country at the expiration of my status, signed on this day."
So you have this little like 3 sentence thing that you sign, and that's enough to get you the visa. Does that preclude you from renewing the visa or filing an extension of status?
No. So, I mean, something to keep in mind is we're talking about at the end of your status. So, if your status ends and you don't have something else lined up, then yes, you have to depart the country, obviously. But if you're just going to extend your status and keep renewing it, this doesn't preclude that.
And one of the other interesting things is, well, would they ever maybe require more than just that signed statement? Could they ask? Under what circumstances would they maybe not accept that as sufficient and ask me for more information?
I mean, with the Department of State, if they generally have other reasons to be concerned, some kind of your history, or
Yeah,
if they
like
just
you've overstayed a visa before or something like that. So if there is something in your history that throws up a red flag, then they can hypothetically maybe ask for more. I have seen it happen here or there. Um, but generally it's where somebody has like some negative history as opposed to just, well, I did a student visa. Like, oh, you spent a lot of time in the US. Like, well, that doesn't matter as long as I did it all legitimately. I got a student visa, maybe I had OPT, or maybe I had a TN for a while before doing the E. It's like that's not relevant. But if you do have some negative immigration history, then yeah, they could maybe ask for more there. All right, so now let's talk about the process. How do you apply for one of these things? So um, if I go and apply for an E2 visa at the U.S. Embassy or consulate, what is the length of that visa?
so the length of the visa really depends on reciprocity. So, again, it's one of those, we'll give you what you give us. And so it ranges from anywhere from 3 months to 5 years.
Yeah, it's kind of wild that it varies so much. For example, when you look at most of Western Europe, we have e-visa treaties with them, and they're all 5 years. Mexico, for the longest time, was 1 year, which was annoying to have to waste so much time and effort to renewing it every single year. Luckily, late last year, they upped it to 4. which is great now. So Mexican nationals can get 4 years on the e-visas. That's why we had a lot of Mexican nationals actually trying to get a second nationality. So even though they qualified as a Mexican, they were going and getting a Spanish passport, an Italian passport, so they could apply for 5 years if they could, as opposed to just the 1 year. But now they're at 4, so they don't have to do that anymore. And the 3-month ones are weird. There's some Middle Eastern countries in particular that have the 3-month one. It's basically a one-time use visa. You get it, you come in, and you're done. If you travel, you have to apply for a new visa. So status is not the same thing as a visa. Visa is a permission. It's a permission to apply for entry, basically. So for 5 years or 3 years, whatever it is, I can come and go and apply for entry. But when I do apply for entry and I'm coming in, what's the length of the status that I'm given?
So the actual status that you get is 2 years.
And that's regardless of nationality. So if you have one of those 3-month visas, you'll come in and still get 2 years. So most of those people will just kind of come and stay. They don't travel a lot that are from those types of countries. So where do I apply?
So you have options here. Unlike a lot of other visas like the H-1B or the L, here you don't have to apply directly to USCIS. You can actually apply directly with the U.S. Embassy or consulate.
And so what's the application process? How do I apply at the U.S. Embassy or consulate in my country?
No, that depends on what country you're from. So each embassy is going to have a slightly different process, different documents, different format, whether you can do it electronically or whether you have to actually show up with a hard copy binder. So the thing to do at that point is to look at your embassy's website and see what they require.
This is so annoying because you have to constantly double check, because not only is each place different, but they routinely like make tweaks or changes or updates and they don't announce it. So you have to double check. The other thing to know is that within certain countries, they have a specific post that has a dedicated e-visa team and you have to apply there. So if you're in Canada, you have to apply in Toronto. If you're in Mexico and you're applying for an E2, you have to apply in Ciudad Juarez or Mexico City. And here's the crazy thing. Ciudad Juarez and Mexico City, they're in the same country, but they have different processes. It's a pain. The main thing being Ciudad Juarez, you have to send a physical file, and Mexico City accepts a digital file. So some places you send in your applications either physically or digitally, and then wait to hear back. And once they've reviewed it, you can go ahead and schedule your interview. Some places allow you to go schedule your interview and just make sure you send it 2 weeks in advance. Some still allow you just to show up. You schedule an interview, you just show up the day of the interview, and they look at it right then and there. Those are rare these days. Most want some form of pre-submission. And then the best countries, the countries I love, are ones that once you've applied once, they register your company. Meaning if someone else from the same company then wants to apply, their application is super easy. They don't have to really present any documentation about the company. They're able to just log in, schedule an appointment, and show up with the information about them and their position. That's it. So you see a lot of places like Japan or England or France will register companies. It's great. Or Canada. Mexico does not, which is a shame since they see such a high volume of E's, and now they're up to 4 years. Why don't they register companies? So if I'm applying through an embassy or consulate, on average, about how long does it take? And again, we're going to say pre-COVID, how long does it take?
So pre-COVID, on average, 4 to 6 weeks. I actually was talking to a client yesterday, I think, and having to look at current COVID, it's upwards of months.
Yeah, I mean, there's some places where like they have, you're seeing appointments right now that are like in September or November, or the ones where you just pre-submit and then you have to wait. I mean, we had a bunch that were submitted last March, in like, for example, in Ciudad Juarez, and like just got their interview. The good thing is that people that are renewing a lot of times are exempt from interviews. So a lot of posts are still processing renewals, the ones that allow you to like submit via email and then you don't need an interview. So those are still being processed. But a lot of the first time ones, you're kind of stuck waiting. But what if we're seeing a lot of this these days, a lot more of this? What if I entered as a tourist? And I came in and I'm setting up the business and I'm getting everything up and running. And now I'm thinking about applying for the E, but there's no appointment availability in my home country. So I'm here in the US as a tourist. What do I do? Or what can I
In
do?
in that case, you would file to change your status with USCIS. So, that 129, submit all of that to USCIS with the documentation just proving everything we just went through, and you can change your status there.
About how long does that take?
So 4 to 6 months is kind of the average time, but there is premium processing available. So if you're in a hurry and have $2,500 to spend on premium processing, you can get it in 15 days.
Which, wow, that's a lot of money. And yes, they did double the amount last year. It used to be 1225, now it's 2500. Here's the tricky question though that people need to know. When I file to change my status, is my family included on the same form as me, or do they file separate forms?
No, so it's got to be a separate form. It's not even the same type of form. But you can submit it all at the same time, bind it all together. So,
But here's
generally
the question.
that's
If we file together but on separate forms, does the premium processing apply to my family as well?
sadly no. And that's the one we hear a lot where folks want to know, like, well, you know, this person got theirs in 15 days, but what about their spouse and their kids that are with them? And unfortunately, right now they're seeing up to a year of wait time, and they're currently not eligible for premium processing at all.
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing right now some where the principal applicant gets approved in 15 days, and then it took the spouse 14 months. That's just unacceptable. But unfortunately, there's not a whole lot we can do about it right now. It didn't actually used to be that way. They used to, as a courtesy, adjudicate them together, but then for some reason, the Trump administration decided that people applying on the family members on their form for some reason needed to go do biometrics, and that's what kind of detached the applications because they needed biometrics. Why? I don't know. They don't require the principal applicant to do biometrics, just the dependents. So hopefully we see some changes here. Also, as part of the fee increase, they were supposed to expand the availability to premium processing to some other categories and forms. So they, of course, immediately up the amount, but have yet to expand the availability, which I kind of know why wouldn't you do it? Because think about all the people that need to file for work authorization that would gladly pay $2,500. And USCIS is an agency funded by its fees. So why they haven't expanded it yet, I don't know. But I guess this is the important question. So if I'm going to apply for the visa at the U.S. Consulate Embassy abroad, can my family apply with me? Do they also get a visa?
Yes, so you can definitely take your family, and if you're applying for that visa abroad, the whole family can go all at once.
What about kids? What's the cutoff age?
Oh, the cutoff age is 21. So up until that 21st birthday, your kids can be dependent on your E2.
Can spouses and kids work in the U.S.?
Um, so spouses can work, but it is not automatic. So if once you get here, you're in the country, the spouse of the E2 visa holder can apply with USCIS for work authorization, that EAD card.
How long does that take?
Um, it depends. Right now, it's taking, I want to say, upwards of 6 months for them to process.
And are there any restrictions on that work permit? Like, do they have to work for the same company that the spouse got their e visa from, or can they work anywhere?
No, for the once you have that EAD, you can work anywhere. So you want to go work for Walmart or work for Google, that EAD will work for you.
Yeah, we've seen some interesting discussions with clients where one spouse is like, well, wait a second. Maybe we can co-own the company. I have an engineering degree and can maybe get a good job. So maybe we'll have you apply as the principal applicant, and then I'm the dependent. So then I can get EAD and go get a job, outside while you run the business. Like you see these interesting discussions in terms of which spouse is going to be the principal applicant based sometimes on the better opportunities for EAD. So Andrew, it's a long discussion. It's a super interesting visa. We do a lot of these. I mean, over my career, I don't know why, but I've done hundreds of these across every country. It's just a niche that I just kind of developed doing these investor visas. I've pretty much seen it all. So if you have a question, go to our website. You can book an appointment to talk to us, right? You can email us, call us, reach out to us to talk about your possibility of an investor visa. Also, don't forget, we have a great app. It is called Law Pilot Guardian, right? You can find it for Android or iOS. Download it. It is free. It's got tons of great information there. It's got a lot of stuff about know your rights in English and Spanish. And we're going to be continually building sort of more functionality into it. So download it. It's a great tool, great resource. Otherwise, Andrew, it's great to have you along for the ride today. Any final comments?
No, appreciate it, Ben. Have a good weekend.
You two, everyone out there, have a good weekend. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to hit us up. We're here to serve. Thank you.